Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest Nava Atlas. Nava is the founder and owner of the Amberwood Press. She's a very prolific author of vegan and vegetarian cookbooks and an illustrated artist. She's really blended art, cooking, and beautiful food, which takes me right home. Now, I really want to go there with her because that's a beautiful thing. She's a very prolific author of vegan books, started with vegetarian books with Vegetariana back in the early 80s. And then I noticed that by the time she segued into the 2000s, she was moving into all kind of vegan publications with the Vegan Holiday Kitchen, Wild About Greens, Plant Powered Protein. In fact, her Vegan Holiday Kitchen was voted by Vegetarian Times as one of the top 100 vegan cookbooks of all time, which is really remarkable. Her Vegan Atlas website also provides remarkable tips and recipes, and her recipes have been featured in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Philadelphia Daily News. And she's been a guest on a number of beautiful podcasts, Martha Stewart Radio, my good friend Victoria Moran with Main Street Vegan, Chef AJ, and also really parlayed her art and illustrating work into visually driven books, which we'll talk a little bit about too, that have been in major exhibitions like Secret Recipes for a Modern Wife, the Literary Ladies Guide to Life, Living, Writing Life, and one that I want to talk about, which is really connected to your mom, My Mother's Stories, served with bagels and lox. So welcome, Nava. It's such a pleasure to have you. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you. Sounds like you know more about me than I know about myself.
I'm not cognitively deficit yet, so that we can say that. I remembered all of that, yes. But what I want to do is I want to start off in a way, because our audience always likes to get an idea. You were raised through the 50s and 60s like I was. You really were born in the mid 50s, and then your childhood and adult and your formative years were during that time, and this is going to be a heavy start, but I want to understand, because you were just several decades away from the major trauma that your family had actually experienced in the Holocaust during the war. And I always wonder about how any of that generational trauma fed or informed, your drive to a movement that was more nonviolent, like veganism, and also your own artwork. Was there any way that informed you on your journey in the early days? So take us through your early move toward veganism, vegetarianism, and your artwork.
That's such an interesting question, and it's one that no one has ever asked me before. You referenced I'm also a visual artist, and the way I like to express myself is through limited edition artist books that also become sculptural. And one that I did a couple of years ago was called My Mother's Stories, served with bagels and lox, but the lox are actual hardware.
Actual lox, yeah.
So the lox represent secrets and traumas. So my parents were not direct survivors, but their families were destroyed in the Holocaust. They both separately moved to what was then Palestine in 1930. My mom had a tremendous case of survivor's guilt. She left home at 17. She never saw that part of her family again. It's interesting because I used that, and I used her experience in my artwork, but connecting it with my first vegetarianism and then veganism, I haven't really thought about that a whole lot. And it's maybe something that I really should think about.
Well, it's such a nonviolent approach. It's such an approach of harmlessness, and it's also such an approach that is tied into social and economic justice. So, I could even see where tangentially that could have some influence on moving in that direction. But aside from that, let's talk about your early beginnings. What were the kind of the aha moments that you wanted to move into a more vegetarian way of living? What inspired that?
Well, what inspired it, and my mom, I loved her so much, but rest in peace, I did not like her cooking. She did like traditional Eastern European
Right.
Jewish cooking. It was really bland, and I don't know, but instinctively, and really, we had no information back then. I'm talking about, let's say, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was in high school. I just didn't like meat. I didn't, I'm a very visual person. I just did not like to see that blob on my plate.
Right. Right.
I asked my mom, I think when I was 14 or 15, my older brother, who was almost 10 years older than me, felt the same way. Sometimes I literally thought he was going to burst out into tears when he saw his food. So I just asked my mom if I could cook so I could disguise the food, because she was really not on board with any of this. We didn't, we didn't have the internet. We barely had a, newspaper. It's like I didn't even really connect that much. Food, farming, animals. Just knew I didn't like it.
Right.
So I started out by cooking and disguising meat, and then I think a couple of years later, I was 16. I just told my mom I'm not going to eat meat anymore. Why I decided this, really, there was no real rhyme or reason. But she said, well, I'm not going to cook 2 meals. If you want to be a vegetarian, you'll have to cook for yourself, meaning this is probably going to come to an end very soon. But no, I took to it. And, I grew up in Michigan outside of Detroit. So you have to learn how to drive at 16. Otherwise, you're not going to go anywhere. So I would go to what we call health food stores. And as you know, back then there were these dusty shops with dusty brown food, very little fresh food, mostly vitamins on, a wall. But I feel like I took to it, and I don't want to say like a fish to water because that's a terrible metaphor in this case, but I just took to it so easily. I would buy whatever barley and oat groats and lentils and whatever we were eating back then, and frozen spinach, and I would just concoct things. So I felt like that urge to create with food came very early, but I didn't really get it from anybody or anything other than maybe something that I was reading. Oh, actually, I will say my cousin very kindly bought me the Whole Earth cookbook, which
I remember it.
Yes. Yeah, as a spiral bound. It was not a vegetarian or vegan cook. Well, we didn't do vegan for a while after a few decades after that. But it was mainly kind of whole foods, simple foods, natural foods. And even in that one, in high school, I would scrawl, this was good, this wasn't good, this is how I would change it. There was a few blank pages. I wrote up my own recipes. So it was something that I really enjoyed as a creative endeavor from the start. Well, my parents stopped being mad at me. They started to want what I was making. My brother, who was, on the way out of the house at that point, he was very happy. And then fast forward a few years, I got married fairly soon out of college. And my husband, who I'm still married to now, really wanted to be a vegetarian. He really, really wanted to be a vegetarian, but he was and is no cook. So he was just enthralled with any simple thing that I made. We were starving artists in New York City. And if we did manage to go out to eat, I would try to recreate what we had at home. And he started to say, well, why don't you write down this recipe so that you could make it again? And so after, maybe a year or so, I had amassed a bunch of recipes that I had concocted. And I'm not a trained chef. I never went to nutrition class or anything. I was an art student. So a graphic designer and illustrator. And I just had the idea to combine my recipes, my love of reading and literature, drawing and design into one book, which became Vegetariana. And back then, and when I republished it, and this is the new edition,
Right.
Fourth edition. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, what was going on in the mid 80s? This came out in 1984 at first. So I tried to count very carefully. In the 70s, there was Molly Katzen and Frances Moore Lapé,
Yeah,
the
of course.
cookbook, and then the Diet for a Small Planet. Then in the 80s, mid 80s, there was, let's say, Deborah Madison, me, a few others. I counted like 12 of us, a dozen who had broken into, the mainstream with vegetarian
Right.
books, 12. And then now, as you know, you can't count the number of vegan
Oh,
cookbooks.
God, you're right. It's uncountable.
It's uncountable. And that's not to mention vegan blogs, vegan podcasts, vegan YouTube channels. So in one way, I feel like, I can't compete in this realm anymore. But on the other hand, I'm thrilled because, that's the biggest change that I've seen and one of the most positive.
Yeah, I always tell people because, I started being vegetarian probably 54 years ago. And I always tell people, I joke around with Michael Clapper and others that have been doing it as long as I have. And we talk about, it's like the old country song. We were doing it when it wasn't cool. You know what I'm saying? It was way back in the day. I remember you just took me back. When I was in chiropractic college, I was in Iowa and we would go to Chicago just to hang out. And it was the first time in the early 70s that there was a restaurant called R.J. Grunt, and they had the first cornucopia salad bar that was unlimited. And in the early 70s, as you made the point, it was pretty dismal. And all of a sudden, this thing was kind of like out of the desert, this first huge salad bar. So it was a remarkable time that you were kind of at the vanguard of a lot of what was going on. And I want to ask you one simple question. How did you deal with Shabbat dinners with your mother and father when you were not?
They weren't observant.
Oh, they weren't observant. Okay. You skated on that. That was easy.
Yeah. Interestingly, it's so interesting because I did not like my mom's food, and yet I have such nostalgia in some other weird way. And let's say for Rosh Hashanah, I will do things that are really familiar but veganized. Like I figured out how to make a really good vegan challah.
That's the power of love and memory. You know that. That's very powerful.
Yeah. I mean, she meant well. She wasn't a great cook, but, she meant well and she loved us. So that was her way of showing it.
I'm here with Nava Atlas. We're going to just take a very short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here. Are you ready for an extraordinary adventure that combines relaxation, exploration, and vibrant health? Then set your sails for the NHA plant-exclusive cruises. Imagine cruising through exotic destinations, savoring delectable plant-based cuisine, and engaging in rejuvenating activities, all while surrounded by like-minded individuals passionate about health and wellness. These cruises offer more than just a vacation. They offer an opportunity to immerse yourself in the NHA's principles of healthy living. And they rank incredibly high on the ratings of eco-friendly cruise lines. We all know how important our oceans are, and our cruise partner, Windstar, is fully committed to this. Join us aboard our upcoming plant-exclusive cruises and experience the synergy of health and leisure. Delight in gourmet, SOS-free meals prepared by talented chefs. Attend informative workshops and enjoy the serenity of the sea, all tailored to nourish your body, mind, and spirit. For more details and to reserve your spot on our next adventure, visit healthscience.org and click the link under Travel. Don't miss this chance to indulge in a wellness retreat like no other. Elevate your well-being and make memories that will last a lifetime. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. Now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with vegan cookbook author, illustrator, artist, Nava Atlas. So your interest in art and graphic arts and all of that started very early in your life. Talk about that, because you were already into art in your 20s, because this book, it really came out in your later 20s, and you were already illustrating and doing artwork. So talk about your journey with art.
Well, that's lifelong. I feel like some people are born with certain talents, like they like to sing or dance. And I kind of feel like as long as I can remember, I always had a pencil in my hand, but also it was for writing because I always loved to write as well. So I don't remember a time in my life where I wasn't drawing or writing. And then in high school, I added cooking to that. So I feel like I'm very blessed to have led a creative life, and not only to have led it, but have been able to make, I've never gotten rich, but I've been able to make a living off of all of these things put together. But, I wanted to go back to another point that you were making about how unusual all of this was in the early 70s. And I remember, in our early days of our marriage, when you tell somebody, let's say you're invited for Thanksgiving and you say, oh, we're vegetarians, people like freak out. It's like, what are we going to make for you? Now it's like, it's so normal.
I know, it's kind of funny when you look back at it, because it's so easy to adapt all of that in the simplest way, and even in beautiful flavors and colors and tastes. And people just were disconnected from that back then, just didn't think about it. And then they were shocked, oh my God, how are you going to get protein? How are you going to do this? How are you going to survive? Right. So what was the next step?
The question has not gone away, as you know.
That was a little bit of a gap between where you were then to the time that you became completely vegan. So talk about that gap, and then what was the next step or the aha moments that directed you to go completely vegan? Let's go there for just a little bit.
That's a really good story, and I have an answer to that one. So we had 2 children, and we decided to raise them vegetarian because at the time, let's say my kids were born, I'm going to date myself here, 89 and 91. And so, we were just on the edge of being able to get more information from the internet. But at the beginning, what did we know? I don't even know when I first heard the word vegan, but it certainly wasn't when I was having my kids. But we decided we wanted to raise them vegetarian, which at the time was controversial enough. And I remember we told them when they were very little, we said, we don't eat meat in our house because we don't want to eat our animal friends. And then I said, but if you go to somebody's house and they have something that you want to try, then go ahead. So they looked at us like we were crazy. It's like, you just told us we don't eat our animal friends, and now you're telling us we can. My reasoning was that I didn't want it to become the forbidden fruit.
Right.
So my kids are, so I said I dated myself. They're in their 30s now. Neither of them has ever tasted meat of any kind or fish. And they're both still quite devout vegans. But as far as the question, getting back to the question that you asked. So, we went along until I would say when they were, let's say 10-ish, 10 and 12, they're 2 years apart. And then we started to get the information, how animals are raised, how dairy cows are raised, what goes on behind the scenes. And I started to feel very uncomfortable. And we're all products of our conditioning, right? And I thought, well, could we really raise our kids without milk? And so this became a real question. And I kind of looked into it. I wasn't telling the kids what I was thinking. But I thought, well, maybe if we get our dairy products from a small farm upstate, we live in New York State, I'll feel better about it. So we took them to this bucolic little farm that distributes milk around this region. I think they still do. And the farmer was very proud of his operation. It was a beautiful day with the clouds in the sky and the green meadow and the black and white spotted cows. I mean, it looked like a painting. So, and then he took us into this room and he said, well, this is where the cows get pregnant. And it was like, oh yeah, they have to be artificially impregnated to calve. But then the turning point was I saw in the distance some crates with little cows in them. And I said, well, what are those? And he said, well, those are going to become veal. It's like, you can't unsee that. So the four of us just kind of went quiet and polite, and we left. And my son, who was 10 at the time, he just couldn't have gone vegan fast enough. So it was a Sunday. So the next day they went to camp. It was summer. And he comes back home. I'd given a rice back then, and we should talk about foods themselves, because back then the vegan cheese was not very good.
Oh no, God no.
We had rice cheese, and it really tasted like plastic. But I gave him a rice cheese sandwich because I felt like I'm going to make this transition very slowly. He comes back from camp, and I see that he hasn't eaten his sandwich. I said, well, how come you didn't eat your lunch? He said, well, because now I'm vegan. And I said, well, first of all, this is rice cheese, but second of all, couldn't you have gone vegan after lunch? But, that was it. He made the decision. People, kids at school teased him. He didn't care. He would give them lectures about how animals are treated. He would not, he would never take the bait. So, and that was it. And then we went on this journey together as a family. And it's always been, again, I'm very blessed. It's been very easy. And both of my kids like to cook. My husband still likes to eat. He still doesn't like to cook, but he makes a good salad.
Okay, well, he likes to eat, though.
Yes.
I understand that for sure.
Yeah.
Well, you got a lot of very interesting notoriety. I mean, your recipes and your holiday fare published in major places, New York Times, Washington Post. How did that come to be? How did you engender that kind of attraction to have these periodicals and these places want to publish what you were doing?
Well, like I said, back then it was more of a novelty. So, oh yeah, vegetarian. I had a vegetarian version of Vegan Holiday Kitchen called Vegetarian Celebrations. And back then, again, because there was less competition, there was more opportunity to be covered in mainstream press. And that just sort of continued on. I've been published by smaller publishers, major publishers. Nowadays, authors have to do a lot of their own publicity, but back then publishers did do a lot more to place stories in mainstream press. So I felt like back then it was easier. A lot of things were easier back then, weren't they?
Yeah,
but the food is better today.
Well, because there was, as you said, there was less of it. You had a kind of a bigger niche in the whole dance, and now, as you say, it kind of gets diluted. There's so much information that I think sometimes people get a little desensitized to the fact that there's so much around them. And I think, it's a little bit more competitive in that way. And your point is well made. Now you got people doing their own self-publishing, and now it's even worse because now you got people using AI to write books, and that's glutting the market with books that they're not even writing. That
I'm trying to think that doesn't exist. Oh my gosh. But, as far as real content creators, I mean, there's Instagram, there's TikTok, and I'm all for it. I'm not really that big of a fan of AI, to be honest, but people are using this information to create amazing recipes, and they have their own audience. So basically, authors nowadays, publishers are looking for people with huge platforms who have a zillion followers on either Instagram or TikTok, which I don't. So I just keep doing my own thing in my own way.
Talk about the Vegan Atlas website. Let's talk a little bit about that. When did that come to be? How long has that been in play? And I see what's on there. Do you have any outreach with people? Do you have any contact with people through that site? Is there anything that you do connected to the website that's online, or any kind of courses or sharings? Or take us through that website and what you're accomplishing with that.
Well, I have to take you back about a decade before then. I actually started a vegetarian website and this was really the early days of the internet. It was one of the first food sites on the web. It was called Veg Kitchen. And I ran that for 19 years. And then I had this notion to sell it, just to see if I could sell it. Well, then I sold it. And then now, the people who I sold it to somebody else. And then somewhere along 2018, I thought, oh my gosh, I don't have a platform anymore. So that's when I created the Vegan Atlas. Yeah, I don't do that much outreach with courses, but I do have a Substack. Now the big thing is for content creators who really write Substack. And I really am enjoying it. And people, it's more like going back to the old-fashioned blogging days where people would like it and comment on it, and then you have a conversation with readers. People can always reach me through theveganatlas.com. I have a contact form, and my, on there, once you're on there and in a post, you'll see not a pop-up, but sort of a highlighted subscription form.
Yeah, let's say that again where people can find you. Let's repeat that again for the audience.
So theveganatlas.com.
Perfect.
And then once you're on a post, you'll see it's called Spotlight Subscribe. It's very hard to miss. And when people subscribe and sign up, then they get my Substack newsletters either once or twice a week.
Good, beautiful. I will tell you, the recipes look fantastic on there. I went through a bunch of them, and they're just remarkable and beautiful, and they look like they're fairly straightforward to translate, which is great, because sometimes you can get these recipes and things that are impossible to do. So these are things that are user-friendly, that look incredible. I haven't had an opportunity to do any of them yet, but I definitely will pursue some of that because they look beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say that I think one of my work has been known for is simple. I don't like things that are too complicated. I feel like I want to keep it real. I want people to be able to come home at 6 or 7 and still have the motivation to make something because it doesn't have a billion ingredients.
Right. And that has to happen for people on the run, people on the go, people with families. I do the same thing in my teaching. We try to make it easy to be successful. That's what I always say. Because if you make it easy to be successful, the chance for success will be much greater in your life because of that.
Right. And I also embrace people who are just curious and want to try things. Right. I would say that probably at least 50% of the people who use and read my books, maybe they're not even vegetarian, but I feel like any small step people can take in that direction helps not only their health, but the planet and the animals, of course.
I want to go a step further because I was intrigued by your artist books and the idea that not only do you have writing that's part of a book, but these almost become a piece of art in and of themselves. So how did that concept come to be? Because it also looks to me like, you've gone a step further and are making certain kinds of social comments, really looking at the mores of the culture. So for example, Secret Recipes for a Modern Wife takes a look at a faux recipe book going back into the 50s. So you're having a kind of a social commentary on a whole gender interaction centered around this idea of a cookbook. And then even like you said with the book about your mother's stories, bagels and lox, and talk about how you envision that, how that came to be, and what kind of reception is there for those kinds of things that you've done. I'm very curious about that.
Well, I've done about a dozen what they're called limited editions. And what it is really, to put it very simply, it's a book that's intended to be a work of art. So normally with limited editions, you can do just one. And I wish I had some here to show. Oh, maybe I do. Okay, so this is my mother's story served with bagels and lox.
Oh, okay.
And it opens up like this. It almost becomes like a kind of a
wow, that's fantastic. Wow.
And then it starts to open in a different direction like this. So it becomes really sculptural and artistic. And so here's my mom's family in Poland. And then I found a notebook of hers that she left after her death, and it's sort of the story of her migration. So that's this one. But what you're saying, I just wanted to say, what you're saying before is really spot on. I just feel, sometimes people say, oh, wow, you do so many different things. And for me, I feel like maybe it looks that way, but they're all under the umbrella of social justice.
Right, right.
Even vegan cookbooks are, because what you're doing, you're advocating for the earth and for animals, but you're doing it in a different way. You're kind of luring people in with delicious food, easy food. And for me, I feel like that's a really good step. If I feel like sometimes I want to yell at people and say, how can you do this to animals? But no, then people will get really defensive.
Well, you're also luring them in with the visual arts, which I love that idea, because if you think about how visual we are as a creature.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is, one of the things that makes plant exclusive food so amazing is, of course, the colors that are linked to the remarkable color perception we have in our own eyes. It's no mystery why fruit and the evolution of food has the most colorful appeal. We're basically fruit eaters by nature. So our eyes can recognize those colors of the mango and the watermelon and the greens. And that's what naturally drives us to select those in a sea of information that and fostered our survival and evolution. So, the eye is a very visual mechanism tied into even the presentation of food, which is so remarkable. I also noticed that you have a real interest in sharing in that book the literary lady's guide to the writing life. You really were into sharing the writing traditions of very successful women in literature. And so I gather that that's also a very important thing for you. You told me that you said at the very beginning that you were a very avid reader. And so I'm assuming that this is something that's very important to you, and you kind of worked it into your own visual art, a way to share those letters and the writings of these very competent, powerful women and their writing abilities in literature. So I'm assuming, is that what you were trying to accomplish with that visual book?
So that's that's also a really interesting story, which is I started it out as a limited edition. And what I thought was, oh, I'm going to gather inspiration from famous women authors about how, how they sat down to work and how they became successful. Well, it became something totally different. It became about their struggles and how difficult it was to live, especially as women, a life in the arts and in writing, and how they all overcame their obstacles. So it wasn't about, they popped out of the womb as successful writers, which is sort of how I originally envisioned it, but that we all share this common struggle to overcome obstacles, especially as women and as women writers and creators. We're the ones often who raise the children, who take care of the parents when they age. How do you live a life in the arts when you have all these other issues going on? So that I feel like I learned so much from them, and that, an artist's life, a writer's life, is not easy, but you do it because it's healing and because you want to give back to the world as well. So
that oppression of women was across all fields. I mean, if you look at it, Camille Claudel was probably at least as good a sculptor as Rodin was, but she was driven into a mental institution, never got the credit that she deserved. Rosalind Franklin was a scientist who was the first one to see the diffraction pattern of DNA, but Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize and she barely got a mention. So we see that all through the history of women's, the place women had in science and the creative arts. So I think it's very important for people to be made abreast of the real history and the creativity that women were expressing, but yet was somehow not really shown in the patriarchy as it evolved across time. So I was happy to see that was some of the artwork that you had been doing. And in my own writing, I write about this because, as you even well know, for the longest time, even the healthcare issues with women were not really addressed as well, because the OBGYNs were males. They were kind of denigrated to second-class citizens. Even today, Alzheimer's disease, which is a very powerful disease, 2 out of 3 people with Alzheimer's are women. No one really talks about that. So, this idea of highlighting the female component across the arts, across science, is, I think, really a profound thing to do, because a lot of us are not aware of the history.
Yeah, I was going to say my other website is literaryladiesguide.com. It's become a huge archive of women's literature. The women I cover on it have all passed because I feel like more women are writing today. And so you kind of have to draw the line somewhere. But yeah, I mean, we still live in a patriarchy. It's gotten better, but it's, when you were talking about OBGYNs, there's a lot of things, as you know, that are going backwards now. So we have to be ever vigilant.
Right. So in terms of where you are now, let's talk a little bit about, where you see yourself going. What's on the horizon for you? What kind of things are in play for you?
Very interesting things on the horizon. First of all, earlier this year, I put out the 5th edition of Vegan Soups and Stews for All
Ah,
Seasons.
beautiful,
My
beautiful.
faves. Oh, and I really do have to give a shout out to my photographer. When I started out, hand drawn was the big thing in
Right.
books, but now people, as you say, people want to see the food. They want to see how beautiful and colorful
Absolutely.
it is. So my photographer is Hannah Kaminsky, also a well-known person in the vegan community. About the age of my kids, we've been working together now for look, at least 12 years. She started really early, so I have
Hmm.
to give credit for a lot of my photographs in my books as well as on my website. So next year, September 2025, I'm coming out with a book, something totally different. It's called Inspired by Cats, Famous Writers and Their Feline Muses, which is illustrated by somebody else, Bob Eckstein, who's a New Yorker cartoonist. Then the following year, I'm coming out with a book called Women Writing Dangerously, and it's about banning and censorship of women's writing from
Wow.
from Harriet Beecher Stowe through all this shenanigans that's going on today.
So this is a compilation that you're doing to expose this writing, basically?
It's to examine how banning and censorship affected women in the past, what it did to their lives and what it did to their careers, and also talks about whose shoulders are the banned books of today standing on. There's a lot of really fascinating forgotten stories there, and I'm
Oh,
really
God,
enjoying doing the
absolutely.
research.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so glad you're doing that. That's fantastic. Uh, and of course, you're still cooking and doing all your stuff, sharing your recipes and doing all those wonderful, wonderful
Still
things.
doing that, still love it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, Nava, as we kind of wind down our conversation, is there anything that you would like to really share with the audience out here?
Oh, that's a broad question. I think it always goes back for me to compassion and living in our global community and being aware of just how harmful it is to continue to do animal agriculture. There was just a news story just yesterday as I was driving about how the Colorado River Basin is almost dry. Why is that? Because of all the water being used and pumped to California,
Right.
basically to grow animals. So the person, I think this was on NPR, she said, well, people are being urged to just, instead of the 3 average hamburgers per week, to cut it back to 2. And I thought, how about 0? How
Right. Well,
people,
my input on that is that, there was a time when, we want to respect people where they are on their journey, and we love to see them make whatever change they can. But I tell people the time for incremental change has actually passed. The
I
house
agree.
is burning. When the house is burning, you got to act a little bit more forcefully. And so I'm of the opinion that if you can survive without it, let's not do it because it's contributing to consequences that we could ill afford. And I really feel like you do for the generations that are behind us that are coming up, and they're having to deal with a world that if we don't really make more than just incremental change, there's not going to be a world the earth will probably go on, but us as a species may not. And that's something that we have to really take a good look at. And that's one of the beauties of adapting to a vegan lifestyle because it supports these love affairs for ourselves, personal health, the rights and lives of all animals around us, and this beautiful planet that we have as a blessing to live on. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's time for no hamburgers a week, frankly. I mean, to be
Oh,
honest.
also to that point, there's almost nothing you cannot adapt to vegan nowadays. With
Absolutely.
all the products. I mean, that's what we touched on it a tiny bit at the beginning about how just the availability of the different kinds of foods and how you can travel now and always get plant-based meals almost
Everywhere,
anywhere.
everywhere. Where I am, we've got vegan pizzerias. I mean, who would have thunk? I grew up in an Italian household back in the day in New York. Who would have thunk there would be vegan pizzerias where you can go in and get calzones, pizza, all completely vegan?
Right.
You know, no one would have ever even envisioned that years ago, but they're all available. And it's so many options, as you point out. And the work you're doing is providing people with those options. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, my husband and I took a road trip, cross-country car trip in 1985, I believe it was, and we had so much trouble finding anything we could eat in the deep South. And let's say there was a vegetable dish, but they would cook it in like fatback or whatever they called
lard
it.
and fatback.
Yeah.
Yep.
So sometimes I'd ask him, well, can you do it without it? And they thought that was hilarious. So fast forward, I don't know, 30 or 35 years. A couple of years ago, I had to be in suburban Nashville. So I went into a supermarket. There's this whole array of vegan foods in the supermarket. And I'm thinking, they're not doing it to be nice to me. They're doing it because there's a demand. There's a demand for it. So I thought,
they're
wow.
doing it because it's consumer demand and the time is right. That's the bottom line now. So,
wanting to end on a positive note, I think from, since we both seem to have come of age at a similar time, I look back sort of nostalgically at the 80s and 90s. They had their challenges, but how many things have really gotten better since then? Not a whole lot, but this has gotten better. This has definitely gotten better. The availability of plant-based foods and just the awareness of it. That has been an amazing change that I've seen in my adult lifetime.
Right, and we'll finish it with it's about damn time too. So,
yes.
So I can't thank my guest, Nava Atlas, enough for joining us today, sharing her insight, her heart, and the beautiful work that she's doing to turn people on to plant-based living and plant-based options. And I urge you to follow her. You can see her location, theveganatlas.com, scrolling across the show notes. And I want to thank the people that have joined us today, because without you, we can't do what we do. And I want to thank you for being part of this very active, healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Nava, thank you so much. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.